The snow was falling silently on the slopes of the Colorado mountains in the winter of 1873. On the day when Buck Calloway changed his fate, he himself didn't know about it. Perhaps it was the Creator's will. For 25 years, he had walked the dangerous trails of the Wild West alone, disappearing and appearing without a trace, like a shadow. But what happened on that cold December morning changed his life forever. Buck was going through his usual morning routine in his mountain cabin. It was still dark outside. Coffee was already boiling on the stove, and the smell of morning bacon filled the small but well-built wooden house. He had built this refuge only for himself and the wilderness, far from any settlement and the noise of civilization. Here, he found peace since leaving the Texas borderlands, where too many people, too many questions, and too many memories haunted him. He hung his rifle on the wall and placed his wide-bladed knife on the table. Through the window he saw the first rays of dawn illuminating the freshly fallen snow. He wanted to start early that day. He needed food for the approaching winter, and before the snowfall he had seen a herd of deer in the western valley. Buck was about to leave when he heard a distant sound. At first he thought it was a wolf, but then he recognized it. It was a human voice. Moreover, a child's. No people had been around for years. The nearest settlement, Redemption Falls, was a good 40 miles from here. Settlers usually avoided this area, especially in winter when the passes were under snow and the rivers were frozen. Buck grabbed his rifle and stepped out into the cold. The voice sounded again, this time closer. He followed the sound, and barely a quarter-mile from his cabin, he came upon a shocking sight. A wagon with a broken axle stood lonely at the edge of the forest. Beside it, a woman knelt in the snow, wrapped up to her neck in a worn blanket. Around her, 3 children shivered in the cold. The oldest might have been 12, a boy who stood protectively in front of his mother and siblings. The middle one was a girl about 8 years old, and the youngest was a little boy barely 4. It was Sarah Jenkins, as it turned out later, widow of Joe Jenkins, who had died of pneumonia 2 weeks earlier while heading to Oregon. Sarah decided to continue the journey with the children, but they got lost in the mountains and now were stuck here in the snowstorm, freezing and hungry. For the first time in his life, Buck didn't know what to do. For 25 years, he had avoided people, especially families. But here stood a mother with 3 children before him, and if he didn't help, they were certainly doomed to die. There was nothing else to do. Buck took them to his cabin. Sarah and the children were a little afraid of him at first. Buck Calloway was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a long black beard and eyes that had seen too much of the world's evil. He wasn't a man of words, and his manner might have seemed rough to those who didn't know him. The first days passed in quiet tension. Buck never sat down to eat with them, preferring to eat in the shed before going hunting or setting traps. He avoided eye contact, especially with the children. Then one evening, when he returned from hunting, he was surprised to hear the children's laughter from inside his cabin. Sarah was cooking something, and the small dwelling was filled with the smell of food like never before in Buck's cabin. Something tightened in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Eventually, Buck realized that Tom, the oldest boy, was interested in hunting. There was something in the boy's bearing that reminded him of himself when he was young. One morning, he allowed him to accompany him to check the traps. They didn't talk much, but words weren't necessary. The boy learned quickly, and soon Buck found himself showing him how to track deer and how to distinguish fresh tracks from old ones. Meanwhile, Sarah took over the household. She cleaned, cooked, and prepared delicious meals for Buck, who now ate with them. The little girl, Mary, wasn't afraid of him anymore. In fact, in the evenings, she asked him to tell stories about the Wild West. Buck was reluctant at first, but then realized it wasn't so hard to talk about old adventures to someone who truly listened with interest. The youngest child, Peter, was the bravest. One day he simply walked up to Buck, took his hand and asked, "Are you our new daddy now?" Buck froze. He didn't know what to say. Sarah immediately intervened and gently led the little boy away, then looked back at Buck shyly. As time passed, winter became harsher. The cabin was often buried in snow, and Buck could only get food with great effort. On one such occasion, Tom accompanied him, but on their way back they were caught in a snowstorm. Buck worried about the boy, who showed surprising endurance. This was the first time Buck honestly opened up to him. He told him that he once had a wife and young son in Texas. That one terrible night, fearing Comanches, they set out in their wagon. That during the journey they fell into a ravine, and only he survived. That he's lived alone since then, chasing peace he never found. Tom didn't say anything, just listened. But when they returned to the cabin, something happened that Buck didn't expect. The boy hugged him. Buck couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged him. As winter passed, with time the mountain cabin seemed to become more and more like home. Sarah's needlework appeared on the walls, Peter's toys lay in the corner, and in the evenings Mary sang songs she had learned from her mother. One evening, when the children were asleep, Sarah and Buck sat alone by the fire. Sarah said that when spring comes, they would continue their journey to Oregon where her brother lives. Buck didn't answer, just nodded, but for some reason his heart felt heavy. If you think, dear viewer, that the story turned in an expected direction here, let me surprise you. Buck Calloway's past soon caught up with him, and not in a way anyone would expect. 3 days later, 2 riders arrived, Dan and Bill McCready, 2 brothers from Texas, bounty hunters who had been searching for Buck in 6 states, not in the name of the law but for revenge. Their father had died in a shootout years ago, and Buck was the one who pulled the trigger. Despite Buck's claims that it was self-defense, and despite witnesses confirming this, the McCready family never believed him. Icy terror gripped Buck's heart. He wasn't afraid for himself, but for Sarah and the children. What if these men don't care about innocence? What if they hurt them in their revenge? While the children were playing in an inner room and Sarah was preparing dinner, Buck grabbed his rifle. "Stay inside," he said, and stepped out the door. The 2 men were waiting in front of the cabin. Buck recognized them immediately, though they were still children when he last saw them. But their features, their look was the same as their father's. "We've been looking for you for a long time, Calloway," said Dan McCready, the taller one. "Time to answer for our father's death." Buck noticed Bill's hand was already resting on his pistol grip. Both men were tense, but Buck knew this wouldn't be a street shootout. These men wouldn't give him a chance. They would attack treacherously, just like their father did years ago. Buck saw he couldn't avoid the confrontation, but perhaps he could lure them away from the cabin. Maybe further away he could defend himself without putting his family in danger. But before he could move, the door burst open behind him. There stood Tom, holding Buck's rifle. "Leave him alone," the boy shouted, his voice trembling but determined. "Tom, go back!" Buck shouted, but it was too late. Bill McCready grinned. "Look, Dan, Calloway has a son. An eye for an eye, right?" In a flash, Buck understood their intentions and jumped in front of Tom. That's when the first shot rang out. The bullet lodged in Buck's shoulder, but he was already lunging forward, straight at Bill McCready. He landed a powerful blow to the man's jaw, who fell backward. Dan drew his weapon, but Tom, who had now recovered from his shock, aimed his rifle and fired. The shot missed but distracted Dan for a moment. That was enough for Buck to draw his weapon and do what he didn't want to. Spill more McCready blood. The sound of the shot echoed through the mountains. Then silence fell. Dan McCready lay dead in the snow. Bill stood up and looked terrified, alternating between his brother's corpse and Buck. Then he turned, jumped on his horse, and rode away. Buck knew Bill McCready would return. And not alone. That night, Buck told Sarah and the children the truth. He explained why he left Texas, and why he lived alone in the mountains. He didn't sugarcoat his past. There were things he wasn't proud of. But in the McCready matter, truth was on his side. The elder McCready had been drunk and recklessly shooting in a saloon and would have hit him if Buck hadn't acted first. Sarah listened quietly, then said, "The man I know is the one who took us in from the storm, who teaches my son, and from whom my daughter asks for stories every night. That man is a good man." Buck lowered his head. He didn't want to look into Sarah's eyes, afraid of what he might see there. But the woman went to him and gently lifted his chin. "We're not continuing to Oregon," Sarah said, "unless you want to come with us." Buck was stunned. "That's madness, Sarah. I'm a dangerous man with dangerous enemies. I can't expose you and the children to that." Sarah smiled. "You're too late, Buck Calloway. We've already become family." And indeed, something had changed over the past weeks. They were no longer just strangers in his cabin. They were more than that. Buck almost felt dizzy at the thought. Family? He, who had wandered alone for 25 years, could now have a family? This shouldn't be happening. There are no happy endings for men like him. But when Sarah leaned closer to him and saw in his eyes what no one had seen in decades, Buck felt that maybe, just maybe, there could be a future for him too. However, Bill McCready's promise hung in the air. The danger hadn't passed, and Buck knew the greatest trial was yet to come. 2 weeks later, Buck watched from the cabin window as 11 riders approached in the valley. Bill McCready had returned, bringing his entire gang with him. Buck picked up his rifle and hat. Sarah and the children were still asleep, unaware of what awaited them. Then Buck did something he never thought he would do in his life. He took off his hat and put it down. Then he placed the rifle on the table too. He took out a paper and laboriously wrote something, which he placed next to Sarah on the bed. He stepped out of the cabin and let the cold morning wind hit his face. He thought about the events of the past few days, the laughter, the dinners shared together, Mary's songs, Peter's hugs, and Tom's proud look when he hit his first rabbit. Then he closed the door behind him and headed toward the valley. The note left in the cabin only said, "I'll come back for you." And did Buck Calloway return to his family? Did vengeance or hope prevail on that cold winter morning? Well, that's a story I'll tell another time. But I'll tell you one thing, Bill McCready never returned to the mountains again.